Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, Ciaran O'Connor. I'm joined today first by my indomitable co-host, Mr. John Wood Jr. How you doing, John?
Not too bad, Brother Ciaran. How about yourself, man? How are you enjoying this quarantine Monday?
I'm okay, all things considered. I managed to make it outside this weekend multiple times, which was big for me. Makes a big difference.
I know that sunshine is a major necessity these days.
Yeah, absolutely. But, here in New York City, things have been pretty grim, and obviously there continues to be a fair amount of bad news in terms of the virus and the number of cases and the number of people who have passed away. But it does seem like we might be sort of getting over the hump. So some small signs of encouragement amidst what has been a very challenging time.
Amen.
But with all of that said, I am thrilled to be with you, and I'm also very excited about today's podcast. We have three fabulous guests who I will introduce shortly. Today, we are going to be talking about the media. In particular, what is the media's role in polarization? At Braver Angels, we've been bringing together liberals and conservatives from around the country, tens of thousands, all 50 states. One of the main things we hear over and over again from both the left and the right is, I think the media is dividing us. And oftentimes we hear at the end of workshops, I don't think we're as divided as the media told us we are. And so I think that's something we want to unpack a little bit. And to do that, we have invited on three guests who are deep in the media and come from different angles. So we have Annafi Wahed, with whom I went to high school, funnily enough. Annafi, like me, worked on the Clinton campaign in 2016, and after 2016 went on to found the Flipside. She can talk more about it, but essentially it's a daily newsletter that breaks down the news of the day on the left and on the right. So you can scroll through the email and you can sort of see how the previous day and the previous week's news and themes were covered by outlets that tend to be perceived as more mainstream or left-leaning versus outlets that are perceived as more conservative or pro-Trump. And so you can get a really good, quick, digestible sense of what the news landscape is versus if you only read the sources that already confirm what you believe. So it's a fantastic newsletter. I think anyone out there who's interested and curious and what is the other side saying? How can I engage with another perspective that I might disagree with, but I might want to understand better? I encourage you to check out the Flipside.
It also has a very distinctive logo. So if you ever get a chance to notice the Flipside bear, or if you ever hear me say that, you'll know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, shouts out to the Flipside logo. Sorry, Annafi, what'd you say?
I just said thank you, but I will also add that some people on Facebook think that because our mascot is a bear that we're Russian propaganda. So yeah, that's I think going to be our new tagline: Russian propaganda.
You'll have some competition in that department too, to some folks.
Cool. Well, we are also joined today by Denise Quinn. Denise is a talk radio host in Oregon, specifically of KYKN in Salem, Oregon. She's been in the conservative media world for a while now. John and I first met her in Oregon when we were speaking to a group of public officials there, and we've really enjoyed having Denise involved in Braver Angels as part of some of our other activities. So we're thrilled to have her on the podcast today. And then last but not least, we have Monica Guzman, who founded the Evergrey, which is a newsletter in Seattle that Monica can talk a little bit more about. And I should also note that Monica has previously been on the heretofore named Better Angels podcast for a really interesting conversation with John Wood Jr., which I encourage all of you guys to go check out as well when you get some time. So thank you guys all for coming. We're excited to dig into this topic. I figure, why don't we first start with you, Annafi, because I think you sort of play a unique role as somebody who really, each day and each week is absorbing news from a very diverse range of perspectives. So I want to just jump straight into coronavirus, because that's obviously something that's just been dominating the news and the headlines for the past month or 2 months or whatever it is. If you had to sort of summarize, how have you seen the evolution in coverage, and how do you see the divide? So how do you sort of see what the general perspective of the mainstream, or the, what some might say is the left-wing media, versus the conservative media, with the understanding that, of course, the conservative media is not monolithic. You have outlets like the National Review, which are not always pro-President Trump, even though they are associated as conservative. And then you have outlets like Fox News and Breitbart, which tend to be more in Trump's corner. So how would you sort of break down that divide? What are you seeing each day? What are the themes that stick out to you?
Sure. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited. I'm just going to jump right in also. So like you said, right, we're consuming both sides of the media every day. Our whole team is sort of steeped in the day-to-day Twitter, Facebook, all of the happenings on social media, on blogs. And in January and February, there was definitely a sort of disparity in how the virus was covered and how the story was being covered. But as we saw the virus unfortunately spread across all 50 states, we're seeing, sort of all of the ramifications of quarantine, both, the human toll and also the economic impact. We're seeing a convergence of people saying, okay, this is real, this is a crisis, how do we handle it? And thankfully, we've seen a shift from how seriously do we take it to, okay, this is a serious thing, to, okay, this is going to be, a paradigm shifting event. And where do we go from here? And actually, we have been greatly encouraged in the past, few weeks to see a lot of areas of agreement between the commentators on the left and the right. So both sides are critiquing the World Health Organization, even if their solutions to the problem are different. We saw a lot of criticism from both sides coming when the captain of the Roosevelt ship was fired. We are seeing criticism from both sides when the financial transactions of the legislators came out. We saw both bipartisan support and bipartisan criticism about the coronavirus relief bill. What's also interesting is the politicians themselves. So you have Representative Jayapal, who's a liberal congresswoman from Washington State, who's proposing a federal government step in to pay the salaries of employees. And Senator Josh Hawley, who is a Republican from Missouri, also made a similar proposal. Their proposals are very similar. It's just a matter of degree, whether it's 50% or 100% or 80%. So we're greatly encouraged, because as much as our job is to highlight the different perspectives, we're more than happy to highlight places where there's agreement. So I think this can be a really good moment for us to sort of come together as a nation, what we hope will be a time for us to reassess and maybe have fewer instances of such hateful partisanship that we had been seeing for the past several years.
Ciaran, can I jump in here with a question really quick? So there is this convergence, Annafi, that you are describing, wherein we are seeing, some degree of bipartisan agreement as well as bipartisan criticism on, various things that we need to be doing in response to the virus, and various ways in which we perceive there as being some common problems. You mentioned the World Health Organization. Obviously, there are other examples. I'm curious to ask you, Denise, very quickly, though, on the specific question of how is the media sort of covering the White House? How are they covering the president's response? And granted, everything Ciaran said about the media being diverse, and you've got, I guess my question is sort of a little bit aimed at the mainstream media, but you can respond however you want. How do you think that the media has been interacting with in terms of its coverage of the Trump administration? Has it tended to be constructive and accurate in your view, or has it tended to go in another direction?
That's a good question. I actually did a little micro poll before I came on here to kind of get a sense of the people in my area, how they feel about it. And the words that came up were tool, not supportive, perpetuating panic. And one of the things that I find when I watch these press conferences for as long as I can stand to watch them, frankly, because they're kind of difficult to watch, is depending on what outlet is being representative, the tone and then the wording of the questions. So what I'm finding is CNN, for an example, will lean a little bit more towards a gotcha, where there'll be an incessant repeating of the question, trying to get to an answer that they seem to want to get to. Where versus you'll have One America News, who tends to be more friendly towards the administration. From my side of the aisle, so to speak, seems to be a bit more measured. So I think there's frustration on the part of those of us in conservative media and conservatives potentially in general that we're not necessarily getting the whole story, and it seems to be wanting to get the president versus wanting to get information to us.
Gotcha. Monica, is split the hair for us a little bit here, because on the one hand, just judging from my own vantage point, both of these things feel sort of true. I feel like if I zoom out a bit, I can see sort of a broad spread of media coverage where the convergence that Annafi is talking about, I can recognize it. On the other hand, we come into this political moment from a prior history where it's pretty clear that I think, in my opinion, even if you don't like the president, it's clear that he's also made many enemies in the press, I think. And so there's plenty of coverage that's critical. And then, of course, you've got coverage, I think, that may come from more conservative parts of the media system that are likely to jump up and defend the president no matter what, in some cases at least. How are you receiving the entire media climate surrounding COVID-19?
I'm receiving it from a perspective of just how unprecedented this situation is for every living human being. I have a 7-year-old son, and when I talk to him about coronavirus, it's difficult to sort what is too much information from what is just right. But one thing that I did decide to really try to drive home to him is the fact that not a single person alive has experienced what the world is going through right now. And the reason I bring that up in the context of media is because we're in such a different mode. We've changed from a mode where our media is telling our stories, reflecting our narratives, serving, the function that it always serves, everything from information to entertainment to soothing to what have you, all these multiple functions. Now we are consumed by a global project, which is to defeat a pandemic. There is more accountability that is being spread to the public. I can pick up the phone and talk to my cousin in Bali, my brother-in-law in Barcelona, and my extended family in Mexico, and we can talk about the same damn thing happening to our lives personally. We haven't seen this since the Spanish flu, and even then, not really. So it's incredible. Now, the thing that comes into play there is often as a society, we look to our leaders and all of these institutions as managing our problems. The issue is that no one alive has been through what we are going through. No one knows exactly what to do. So the anxiety and the uncertainty that we're all wrestling with is actually pretty on the level. So there's not that much difference from the people in power and everyone else when it comes to a lot of critical and anxiety-inducing questions. How long are we going to stay home? Right. What's going to happen to our economy? What am I supposed to do to take care of myself and my family? What about my friends in my community? So when I think about the convergence, I think about it less as being a convergence between left and right, and more as a convergence just to primal human instincts of protection, survival, and trying to understand our own creative potential in a moment like this. So I see us taking a step back here and there, not everywhere. Some steps back from the typical, who do I blame? Who do I, whatever, like point fingers at, and a little more like, oh my God, this is an extremely scary time. How do I moderate my media consumption? What messages am I receiving? Am I receptive to? So we can go a bunch of places from there, but that's how I approach all this.
Yeah, that was powerfully stated. And I think that it is worth sort of drilling in on the fact that this is it's an unprecedented moment that we're in, but it happens against the backdrop of the fact that technically we're still in the middle of an election season. This is, 2020. Everybody was looking forward to a calamity at this moment, right? In terms of politics and polarization. But something has now happened that I think in some areas, and I saw David Brooks was tweeting some poll numbers along these lines, and I read a piece in the Fulcrum the other day that I actually referenced in an article for Braver Angels that had some data along this direction. There are ways in which I think the American people are starting to feel a little bit closer to one another in spite of social distancing. Because like you said, Monica, and of course there's some global solidarity in this, we're all dealing with, just sort of an existential response to an existential problem. But Annafi, does that mean that the market for partisan media at the moment is decisively diminished? Or does that mean that we need not worry about the negative impacts of the sorts of attack journalism that we've become so used to?
So I think we should be worried for the media industry as a whole, and the devastating effects on the news industry due to Google and Facebook are just being exacerbated by this recent crisis. So I think there are over 1,800 newspapers that have shut down between 2004 and 2018. A quarter of newsroom jobs have been lost since 2008. So part of the reason there is more commentary is because fact-based reporting, investigative reporting is expensive. Whereas someone can just sit on a couch and tweet out whatever they're thinking, right? So the good news is we're seeing some encouraging trends. The importance of local journalism is at the forefront right now, because the local journalists on the ground can tell you, where to get food, which grocery stores are open, how to get tested in your local area. All of those things, local journalism is playing a really vital role, and we're seeing people. Local journalism is seeing double the traffic, as well as international sources. And we're not seeing an increase in partisan sites. So there's a fight to quality that is local journalism, that is more established news outlets, that is international news sources, which I think will only be good for the media industry. Having said all that, no, partisanship is not going away. You can see that in the approval ratings. You can see that with all of the election campaigning that's still happening digitally. One thing I do worry about is whether or not this unifying experience we're all having, which is unifying us momentarily, will continue once we're seeing some countries deal with it better than other countries. Will we have multilateral institutions get shored up with increased support or defunded? Will we have more discussions about borders? These are all questions that will sort of further the partisan divides, I think, in some ways. So that's what I think might be happening down the line.
Right. There's also a split at the moment, I think, that in certain areas seems to be becoming more pronounced over whether or not we need to be focusing like a laser beam on continuing the policies of social distancing and quarantine, but also sort of shutting down the economy for the sake of dealing with this virus. There's a bit of a contrast between that focus and a focus on saying, look, obviously we need to deal with this pandemic, but on the other hand, we need to recognize the fact that, in President Trump's words, the cure might be worse than the disease, right? And so I certainly just kind of, and it's not just Republicans and conservatives saying this. I hear this just sort of anecdotally in my part of LA, which is not a very conservative area. People are worried about the fact that they are losing jobs and that our ability to sustain ourselves financially is jeopardized. Denise, I'm wondering, from your point of view, is that, and by the way, we had a Braver Angels debate about this for folks who are listening just last week, and we're having another similar debate tomorrow. Denise, from your standpoint, is that side of the conversation well represented in the media discussions that you're taking in?
It's starting to be. There were maybe a week or two back, you couldn't even necessarily raise that question without sort of getting a side eye, like, do you want people to die? Because you actually wanted to have the conversation that economic strife, but shutting people in their home for weeks and weeks and then the ramifications and what happens as a result of that also can cause people to suffer and die. What I'm finding now is there's a Venn diagram out there that says, worried about COVID, worried about authoritarian overreach because that's happening too, and worried about the economics, me right in the middle. You can be all three of those things. And that's what I'm seeing. And in my conversations, and I want to kind of piggyback on what Annafi said too, that local media, my focus has really shifted from national to pull back to local. And I see the growth in local as well and the importance. And I hear that from my listeners and people that I talk to. It's sort of like, it's more important to find out what's going on really right in my neck of the woods. And I actually have more control over that. And it gets a little bit more empowering knowing that I can affect that much more than something way out in, DC or wherever. So yes, and people are asking, do you know anybody who has COVID-19? And I don't, but I do know people who are going bankrupt. I do know people, I have very dear friends who were losing their restaurants, who were losing their livelihood. My son was laid off. So those economic damages are just as real. And so we have to find a way to find that balance between taking care of the most vulnerable. All of us care about that and want to do that versus also creating a whole new class of people who are vulnerable that we're going to deal with months, years down the road. So I am seeing a bit of a shift in the narrative of that. And I'm glad that we're able to have that conversation without what felt like being a little kind of vilified for even bringing it up.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Denise, I'm glad you brought that up because I think that is the most, fascinating and harrowing moral question of the moment.
Yep.
And, we're a diverse country with lots of different viewpoints. Depending on where you are, here in Seattle, you might imagine very blue, right? Everyone's just on board with the medical experts, stay home. We're doing a pretty good job of it, apparently, compared to other places and, what have you. It matches our culture. It matches our worldview. But there are other parts of the country where, look, there's different values, at play. There's a completely different viewpoint. The economy plays a very different role than in a place like Seattle where the tech industry is booming and what have you, right? And a healthy conversation about such a tough moral quandary would leave open so much more, right? We would be able to really put it all on the table respectfully and understand what you just said, which is, look, it's not, the answer can't just be lives always win. And we're going to look at it in this binary way. You either kill people or you don't. It's clearly not that simple. And so that what it means though, is that everyone across the spectrum has to sort of pause and peel back the layers of their own ways of looking at it to really try to step into the shoes of others. And that is really where we come back to the divided media, because we are decades into so much partisanship that our muscle for doing that is so weak. And our need for doing that right now is so urgent because we have to be as wise as possible, right? And again, going back to what I was saying before, our leaders, say what you will about how hard they're trying, how competent they are. They have not ever had to do this before. Everyone's trying their best with the expertise they have, but we're really all kind of making it up as we go along too. And then we, like children on a playground, we're looking around at other countries going, are they doing better than we are? What's going on? What do we learn? There's a lot of these opportunities to, point fingers, compare, etc. And so how do we get everyone to the healthiest possible cognitive and moral instincts? And we can only do it together. Anytime I see somebody say this, it's the way I see it, and that's the end of the thing. I'm like, it's really not. It's really not. No one person has the answers right now. And that might be the toughest thing of all.
Just to add a very quick data point, there was a study that showed that at least 250,000 people die every year from poverty in America. So the economic impact does also matter in terms of lives saved. And I think it is unfortunate that there's such a partisanship in that conversation. But Joe Biden wrote an op-ed yesterday that talked about opening up the economy back in stages, right? So we open up offices and construction sites, but not maybe arenas and movie theaters. So hopefully that shift will continue and we can actually talk about it rationally now.
Yeah, and one thing that occurs to me is one of the underlying issues here, I think, on both sides of the aisle is the lack of trust in the media. And so a lot of people are accustomed to viewing media, particularly media they associate with the other side, as completely underhanded and pursuing an ideological agenda rather than fact-based reporting. At the same time, I think it cuts both ways, because I think you have a president who plays pretty fast and loose with the facts. I mean, President Trump was saying, he kept saying, no one could have predicted this. No one could have predicted this. That's not true. There are lots of experts who predicted it. He was saying, this is a miracle. It's going to disappear. So I think there's this loss of trust because people from the White House are seeing statements that they don't necessarily know are true. Maybe they think the president is just sort of relentlessly being optimistic. And then you have people going on the media and seeing things that they see as potentially sensationalist. And so the resolution that we're going to have for the debate tomorrow, we're going to be bringing together hundreds of liberals and conservatives from across the country to do an online debate. And they are going to be debating whether or not they think the mainstream media coverage of COVID-19 topics is doing more harm than good by stirring up fear and panic instead of informing with facts and truth. And obviously, that's not necessarily an either or, but I wanted to see how you guys sort of come down on that spectrum between fear and panic versus facts and truth, especially when in this case, a lot of the facts are themselves quite scary.
They are quite scary. And, you look at just the models that are being used. The numbers are shifting in that. I actually just wrote down a couple of headlines too. You talk about stoking fear. A narrative will get pushed out there. The couple that ate the chloroquine for the koi pond, and that from the channels that I see kept getting pushed. And then literally it was Steven Crowder who did a little digging and found out some of the truth behind it. So it's some unusual sources sometimes that are finding these things. The same thing with just another headline to cite. Trump will gain financially because he owns stock in the company that COVID-19. And I'm not defending Trump here. I've been a very vocal critic. So I just want to be clear. But what I'm finding is when you see stories that are pushed out there that are constantly that drumbeat, when you've got a segment of the population that is already mistrustful, that doesn't do anybody any good. So if you're not believing the media, something is going to fill that vacuum. And that's where you get conspiracy theories and you get all kinds of wild things going on, which stoke even more fear. And, I know you probably waded onto your social media feeds. It's a little crazy out there right now, where the point where it's like, just want to kind of turn it off, because at the point of being oversaturated with everything that you don't know what is true, I'm going to go read a book in my backyard.
Right.
Absolutely.
I mean, you just get kind of exhausted by it all.
Absolutely. I mean, y'all brought up something earlier that I think is worth highlighting, which is local media. We're seeing a focus on that because local media tends to give information that is about utility, meaning local media tells you what you can do. These are the restaurants open. This is where you can donate or volunteer. Whatever. Like this is the school closure things and resources for your community. And so you can kind of imagine a spectrum, right? Let's take like information and stretch it out over a line. Over here is the information that is about utility. What can you do right now? And I would sort of argue that information that is about utility is it doesn't spark panic and doesn't spark fear. If anything, it sparks power.
It's empowering.
And control, right? Like here's what you can do. But then you cross over the spectrum, and what you do is you get to these bigger, deeper questions that have no answers. Questions like, will I lose my job? What's going to happen in my community? Who should I be angry toward? Which is one of those things that it's questions we all ask whether or not we like to admit it. Those questions, the more emotional they get, that's where any stories that speak into those sets of anxieties are going to stir up fear and panic. But the key, actually, Ciaran and John, I love that you guys phrased the resolution with the phrase stir up, because you didn't say it created the panic, created the fear. It doesn't. It stirs it up, right? Because it lives within each of us. We all know that the media doesn't just make things out of, well, sometimes, but rarely, right? Like if media are speaking into existing anxieties and that connects, it's because there are existing anxieties to speak into. So, and that's where that whole debate about like, well, where does this all created and should we blame media? It's like, well, what I want is to think about how do we all build systems and institutions, including media, that mobilize and motivate and inform us in the most empowering ways, right? Utility, awesome. That's super cool. Stories about who to blame, why they're useful. Why are they useful? Like the New York Times, I read the New York Times religiously, and they have reported on the story of who to blame at least 20 times in the last 20 days. And it's because their audience is very, very occupied with that, right? And frankly, so is everyone. Fox News is doing the same thing, Breitbart, The Hill. I mean, you can go all across media. Everyone has their own exploration of the story. Who should we be angry for? To who is to blame? You know, either it's Trump or it's not Trump, or it's the doctors, or it's the other countries, or it's China, or it's whatever. But I just come back and go, okay, how useful is that? How actually useful is blame right now?
Yeah, your illustration there, Monica, I think is very useful. I don't know if you're familiar with this terminology, but I think part of what you're expressing here is sort of the spectrum that exists from, you use the word utility, but tame problems on the one hand, right? So local media, I think, has a greater tendency to deal with tame problems, meaning problems that have sort of a more straightforward mechanical or mathematical kind of solution to them. And then as you scale up to the national side, suddenly you start dealing with wicked problems where we can't even really agree on what the nature of the problem is because it's got a social dynamic that's tied into all sorts of cultural and ideological subjectivity. And so, you know, if you ask the question, is high government spending a problem? I mean, if you're coming from a fiscal conservative standpoint, you might say, well, yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem for the budget. It's a problem for the economy, therefore, for all of these other reasons. But if you're coming from a more liberal policy point of view, you might say, no, higher spending is good if it means that we're investing in public goods, if we're investing in infrastructure, social problems, et cetera, right? And so, you know, that's just kind of a simpler example, but it gets so much more complicated than that. And so, Annafi, I see us as kind of being at a little bit of a fork in the road here, because on the one hand, it seems like there are trends we can identify in this moment that suggest that, you know, maybe people are taking this time to reconnect to each other on a communal level. Getting back in touch with local journalism is a great example, but also doing what we're doing at Braver Angels and other folks, which is making use of Zoom technology and other means by which we can connect in spite of our physical distance, and we've got a little more time to do it, right? But it also seems like the political context, particularly as maybe we start to come out our doors again, also is rife with opportunities for us to start, you know, finger pointing at each other once we sort of step fully into the economic side of this situation. Where suddenly the market for the blame game I could see it really blowing up as we move forward. So I'm wondering what you think about that fork in the road.
So some things I'll say to stand up for the media here is one of the hard things is that even with the best intentions, and not to say all media outlets have the best intentions, but even well-intentioned reporters, commentators aren't good at identifying for their reader what they know, what they think, what they suspect, and what they're just pulling out of thin air. So with misinformation coming from China, with the fact that there is no convincing story that there's no convincing story that is an alternative to the story that the virus originated in a wet market. At the same time, U.S. intelligence officials have not ruled out the possibility that, in fact, there was a lab that was involved and it was human error from the lab and not from the wet market. So that there's a level of uncertainty there. So to dismiss people who think it came out of a lab completely is actually worsening the problem, because there is quote unquote truth there in that there is uncertainty in the origin story. There is uncertainty in the number of deaths and the number of tests, because we're not sure how reliable the data sets are that we're getting from the various countries, and how truthful government officials are being, not just in China, but also in other countries. It's just hard to project things, obviously by definition, that haven't happened, right? So 538 just came out with a comic strip that explains all of the uncertainties that go into a model. So when people say, oh my gosh, the model predicted this and now this is happening, see, the models are wrong, the experts are wrong, et cetera, et cetera. And that's very dangerous. We need to bring back faith in experts, but we can only do that if the experts are communicating clearly about what their data sets and their limitations are, and the journalists are then reporting that truthfully. We're seeing some restoration of faith in experts. So according to polling data, people think the federal agencies are doing a good job. They think their governors are doing a good job. We're not seeing that same jump in faith in media yet, but hopefully there's room to correct that. So I think in general, with a moving target, whether it's number of jobs lost or number of deaths or vaccines in development, et cetera, it's really up to the media to be even more communicative and transparent about what they know, what they don't know, what they suspect. Here's the evidence. Here is why we're convinced XYZ is going to happen, rather than XYZ is going to happen. Listen to us.
And obviously, all of this takes place within the context of 2020, which John mentioned earlier. Obviously, it's so hard to predict, just given the dynamic nature of today's media, today's politics, the speed at which things move, the unpredictability of the crisis. But I think it's safe to say that this storyline, context, and climate will persist for the next few months. And obviously, it's already changed the campaign season massively. Neither President Trump nor Joe Biden can be out there doing in-person events. They can't really be doing fundraisers. While President Trump, can do his daily presser, Joe Biden is in his basement, doing interviews. And so,
is that where he is?
Yeah, his basement of his home. And so, I mean, it'll be interesting to see. I think probably they won't end up having their conventions this summer. It's possible that the election in some ways could come down as sort of a referendum on how Trump has handled the crisis and the ensuing economic fallout. So I'm just wondering, how do you guys see this playing out? If we're sort of at this fork in the road where we're already so polarized, do you think that this crisis will sort of bring people together? Or do you think that everything will become shaded by the existing divide of whether you're red or blue? Because I think if you are a Trump supporter, you tend to think Trump has done a very good job, and you think the criticism levied against him for the most part is unfair. If you criticize Trump, it's very easy to point out all these instances in which he was mistaken, and you feel like he was criticizing the experts. I mean, he just, I think, tweeted or retweeted something last night that had the Fire Fauci hashtag in it. So I think both sides have things they can point to. How do you see this playing out through November, with the caveat that making political predictions in this era is always a risky endeavor?
Well, that's why I asked earlier, why is the blame story useful? And that is why the blame story is useful, right? Every media outlet, from whatever point of view they're coming from, we need to understand as a society how we got here in order to make a good decision about where we should go next. And a lot of ink has been spilled digitally and actually on that question for centuries, right? It's just like writing together and understanding our common story is really important to any society. But, the division means that we're not writing the same story. We're writing, kind of two categories of stories, but really there's a lot more sort of division in between the division. And so that's why to your question about the fork in the road, I do see, unfortunately, more of the latter happening, that with time, you can make a story whatever you want it to be. No matter what you believe, you can do it. I've always been very amazed with writers of TV shows, like the most convoluted, complicated TV shows. It ends the season and you go, how are they gonna solve that next season? Then over the summer, one of the actors dies and you're like, what? They're never going to be able to figure this out. It's not going to make any sense. And they come back at the next season and it all makes sense. They figured it out. You can patch together a story from anything. So if your set of values and you already believe Trump is blameless, look, no one alive has been through this. There's no way he could have known. I appreciate the fact that he's impulsive. He asked hard questions that, others would be too polite to ask. And I appreciate that. Or you can say, Trump is a doofus. He's always been. He can't handle this. He couldn't handle it before, and he's definitely not going to handle it next time. And you can make compelling cases to the people who are predisposed to believe those things. And I don't know that any further ink spilled is going to change that basic fact, right? Like, what is the earthquake that would shatter people from those core ways of looking at someone like Trump, for whom we've already spent so many dozens and dozens and hundreds and thousands of hours debating over the last 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah.
I mean, you know?
Yeah, I concur with that. I don't necessarily see too much of that changing. And I go almost to a cultural level. And you're talking, Monica, about television shows, things like that. As a culture, an American culture, we don't have a lot of those common touchstone moments anymore. And a lot of that stems from 24/7 news. I remember back in the day, dating myself here, when we had 3 channels in OPB, you know, and then that was it. And you were not constantly saturated in this. We had common touchstone moments, cultural moments. We're getting more and more split. You know, everything is on demand. There's not that commonality. So, and you talk about an earthquake, you would think a virus of this magnitude, what we're dealing with might be that earthquake, but I don't know that it is. I don't know that we'll be different on the other side of this, that will be better, that I don't know how much will have changed. And so I agree that I think we're going to see a lot of the same, if you were for him or not. I do know a lot of people anecdotally, just in the work I do with the Republican Party here, that are, it's like, you guys are so harsh on this guy that you're making me defend him. Stop making me have to defend him because it's just so over the top. But my concern also is with local politics too, because it is all local. And you're going to see maybe turnout numbers that aren't there for really important races, such as city council races and races that really affect you. So I think the fallout from all this is going to be wide reaching, tentacled into many areas of our lives. And I'm not super cynical about it, but I'm not really optimistic about it either.
Mm-hmm. So let me try and tie a few things together and get some reactions to it, because, so I mean, we've talked about being at this fork in the road, and yeah, Monica, I mean, and Denise, I hear what you guys are saying. When we're baked into our opinions as thoroughly as we are, you know, I mean, the whole point of an organization like Braver Angels even existing is in response to the fact that, you know, we very naturally become entrenched in our point of view, which is fine for us to have our convictions. We encourage that, but we also need to be able to maintain a discourse that allows for some flexibility in our ability to collaborate and see each other in new and more humanizing lights. I mean, Ciaran, when you mentioned Donald Trump sort of playing it fast and loose with the facts, I hear you. There's also, but when you said that, and you know, many people have criticized the president for not taking the virus serious enough earlier on. Suddenly, I heard Dave Rubin's voice pop up in my head because I heard him earlier, and he was making the point that, well, hey, you know what? If you look at the Democratic debates in the month of February, they don't even mention the virus in any of those debates until the last one, when we were already on lockdown and Biden and Bernie were debating one-on-one, and at that point the whole thing was about the virus. He mentioned that to show that the Democratic politicians and the left-leaning media wasn't really taking it as seriously as they're saying now. And so that ties into this idea that, yes, you know, you can see the market starting to emerge for who gets to win the battle to sort of reframe the history leading up to this moment. But Annafi, I'd like to get your point of view on this. I think what we also see about this moment, and what we're sort of trying to capitalize on here with Braver Angels and the work that we're doing in holding these debates every week and getting people involved in organizing and communicating together, and what we see in the shift towards local journalism, et cetera, is the fact that the sheer novelty of this situation has sort of created space, I think, for us to re-examine some of our habits, right? Some of our habits in terms of how we communicate with each other, how we consume information, and maybe in terms of how we build together. So for everybody certainly in this panel here, and for the folks, I think, listening to us, who I would imagine have some interest in this idea of how do we reshape our civic culture in America and our civil society in a way that's more amenable to the type of trust building, community building we want to see. Annafi, do you have some advice or some wisdom in terms of sort of what are useful habits for us to begin to cultivate, certainly in a media space, but also beyond, to get to that more perfect union that we're looking for?
So I'm going to take 3 steps back now and talk more broadly, not just about the media outlets specifically, but what we as people can do. So one thing that we need to get implemented in our education curriculum is media literacy. We need to teach people to differentiate between fact and opinion, to look for clues for when something is fake or false information. We're seeing some good trends. Some recent studies have shown that the younger generation, whether it's high school students or ages 18 to 29, are significantly better at detecting fact from opinion and are less likely to spread false information on social media compared to the older generation. I think that's partly just because they have grown up in the tech era in a way that the older generation, obviously hasn't. So, but we need to implement media literacy, absolutely. We need to become more discerning consumers ourselves. What I always tell people, right, it's easy and often justified to hate on the media, but the media isn't mostly in a for-profit environment. If nuance and bipartisanship sold, they would be selling it. So we as consumers are responsible for not clicking on the clickbait articles, so therefore they're no longer clickbait. We need to seek out and fund and support local journalism, investigative journalism, fact-based reporting. That's on us as consumers, because the social media companies, the media outlets, they're only giving us what we have repeatedly clicked on and shared, and that's on us. And the last thing I'll say is, again, going back to all the uncertainty around statistical modeling, all the uncertainty around the vaccines and development. I think there are over 200 trials across the US, China, and the US and the EU. People need to be educated on, scientific inquiry and the scientific process. And so that's beyond media literacy into numerical literacy and scientific literacy. So until we have an educated populace that's able to discern fact from fiction and fact from opinion, I think blaming it all only on the media is only going to get us so far.
We've got a few minutes left, and I want to get Denise and Monica in on this point too. Denise, what's your advice to the American people? What are some of the habits and practices that maybe we should be building up during this moment where it seems like we may have the space to start approaching things a little bit differently?
Number one, get out of your echo chamber. We're very much into my opinion needs to be validated versus challenged. I think we need to know what we believe, why we believe it, and be able to articulate that and to have that dialogue, to do what we're doing here today on a even more of a micro scale within our own communities, to not be afraid to do that. I know many conservatives who are they don't want to speak up because there's fear there. We need to break through that fear, be able to articulate what we believe, and don't rely on one or two sources of media. Broaden it out. Flipside is a great, my son, I told him about that. He's going to go over and check it out. We tend to want to stick with what we know that is going to agree with us. We have to have the guts and the gumption to go and be challenged and maybe be wrong.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. I would point to this. Y'all ever had the experience of going through your Facebook feed? You're just going through it kind of blindly. Yep. And then you put it down, and then you realize that you're a little more anxious, but you don't know exactly why. Yeah. Something you saw in one of your friends' posts, you don't know what. I've had this experience enough times that I've actually gone back to try to identify what that thing was. And it's some way that I'm comparing myself to a friend, some professional contact who just got some kind of win, and I'm feeling some kind of resentment, whatever ugly thing just happened in my head. The same thing happens with the news. So think of the ratio of headlines we are exposed to stories we actually read. Headlines are designed for good reason to stir up anxiety, because if you don't stir up at least some cognitive dissonance in the reader's mind, they're not going to click, right? They've got a lot going on. So every headline, even the positive ones, are meant to stir up some anxiety. So when you consider that, we probably read 99 headlines for every one story we actually read. That's 99 pieces of anxiety-stirring information, but only one that we were curious enough to delve into for any reason. So my advice is lower the ratio, fatten it up, reduce the headlines you expose yourself to that you do not spend time exploring. Otherwise, you are going to introduce unconscious anxieties into your head. And by the end of the day, you're going to be talking about the end of the world, which I have done with my husband countless times in the last month, and then woke up the next morning gone, what the hell came over me last night? So, it's that. Headlines are meant to stir up anxiety, but unconsciously as you read through them. So watch out for that dynamic.
America needs to go on an anxiety fast. Monica, we couldn't really put it any better than that. All right, folks, we're just about at time. Ciaran, why don't you take us home?
Sure. Well, I think this is a good preview for what we're doing tomorrow. What we did here today is exactly what we want to spread around the country and give people an opportunity to do in their own communities, in their own families, and online. And obviously, there are some disadvantages to online as opposed to in-person engagement. Sometimes it can be hard to stimulate that same level of intimacy, but there are also advantages. Number one, you can have much larger debates. We've been using Zoom to separate people into all sorts of breakout rooms. You can also have a lot more geographical diversity. So you could have a debate between a group from, the wealthy Boston suburbs with a group from rural Louisiana. That's something that would be much harder to do in person. So we're really excited about these debates. And I would encourage listeners, because we're going to put this podcast out as soon as possible. We're having a debate tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern. The topic, again, is going to be about coronavirus in the media. So if you listen to this podcast, sort of whet your appetite a bit. Hopefully, these wonderful guests offered some really, I think, insightful and frankly empowering remarks. And so I think everyone out there should feel empowered to get in on the conversation, because as we discussed, in some ways are at a fork in the road. I think a lot of these underlying trends are going to continue, but ultimately it does come down to agency, which is something I think Monica was just alluding to just now. So I hope you guys like this conversation. Let us know if you have questions, compliments, complaints. We take it all. And please feel free to jump in tomorrow night. We want you to voice your opinions. We don't want you to hold back. We want you guys to be passionate and articulate, but we want you to challenge yourselves, not just validate yourselves, which is something that I also heard on this podcast, which I think was a really good way of putting it. So thank you, Monica. Thank you, Annafi. Thank you, Denise. We will have you guys back soon. And thank you, Mr. Wood Jr., for being my co-pilot. And we will see you next time.